Jumbo shrimp. There's reasons for why I do what I do. The gospel delights in putting two realities together that seem to be contradictory. This paradoxical or oxymoronic, how's that? Big word. Oxymoronic. Nature of truth. An oxymoron is when you put two words together or concepts that seem to be contradictory, like jumbo shrimp. Or like pretty ugly. Isn't that something is pretty ugly? It's like, what do you mean? Is it pretty or ugly? Some have said military intelligence is an oxymoron. Or United Methodist. How's that one? That got some laughs. But this is leading into David and Goliath. I'm not trying to just be cute. Jumbo shrimp. David is little. Goliath is big. But who's really big and who's really a little tiny boy inside? It's not always what you think. And the gospel loves, I'm tempted to say turn things upside down, but actually what the gospel is doing, turning things right side up. We're the ones that are confused. God's not confused. And here's the way the gospel talks. This paradoxical and oxymoronic nature of truth is found everywhere in the Bible. For example, and this is the great series to preach from if you want to preach on the oxymorons, the way up is down. The way to be wise is to be a fool. The way to gain is to give. The way to be joyful is to mourn. The way to be first is to be last. The way to live is to die, and there's others. But one of the greatest comes in seeing these, one of the greatest of these seeming contradictions is the mustard seed reality. Remember the parable of the mustard seed. Jesus said, though it's the smallest of all seeds, it's the biggest. It's like, what does that mean? What does that mean? And you're leaning forward and saying, Master, I'm not sure I'm getting it. This mustard seed reality, that bigness comes in being small, and strength comes in being weak. And if you haven't begun to see this in the gospel, it's on every page when you begin to see it. It's an upside down world. Those who've turned the world upside down have come here also. And I think the apostle said, no, we're turning it back right side up. You're the one that's confused about richness and riches and power and strength and wisdom. Jesus got it right. Anyway, no story illustrates this better than the battle between David and Goliath. I mean, this is sort of the exhibit A for strength and bigness and smallness and weakness. We love stories about how an underdog, the blank there is underdog, wins an upset victory. And incidentally, anybody know the author Malcolm Gladwell? He's written a book called Tipping Point. And not a Christian, but he wrote this book, and I ordered it 10 days ago, and I finished it yesterday, so I wanted to really read it. It's called David and Goliath. I've got it in your footnote there. The subtitle is Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants. And he's not a Christian, but what's that? Oh, oh my! Well, thank you. Yeah, well, his treatment. Thank you. I mean, this is getting a lot. It's called an international bestseller, whatever that means. But he's getting a lot of press, and you'll see once you see his name, you'll say, "Wow, I've seen his books." The way he treats David and Goliath, he really takes a very human approach to David. He says, just sort of do the military strategy on this. A rock hurtling at 90 miles an hour is a much better strategic advantage than a big giant in cumbersome armor lumbering around. It's like just it makes sense. But that's not really the point of the Bible story. But what he's got is a collection of about a dozen stories of little people who made giants fall. And he's got some stories about race, the story about how leukemia, very interesting I got a real education on the doctor who discovered how to fight leukemia was a David going up and against an establishment that said, you can't do that. You're killing children when you do it that way. But it's the principle is the underdog. And what's big and what's small, what's weak, what's strong. It's very interesting. Culturally, it's interesting. Spiritually, and in the gospel, it is very interesting. And when some giant legal firm comes in and says, we want to take your cross off your water tower, it's like, I feel paralyzed because Goliath just lumbered onto my terrain, and it's like, I don't think we can do anything. I think we just need to curl up and pray they go away, or something. It's like, welcome to David and Goliath. There's what? Risk. Taking risks. Yeah, good. You've read it. You've got some readers here. So, yeah, thank you. Anyway, I've given you a list. I came up with 11 examples of underdog stories. And I was talking with the ladies in the office, and they said, well, our list is different than your list. It's a fun list. I don't want to get stuck on this, but there's a lot of, this is a theme that recurs, and our human beings are captured by this David and Goliath reality. The tortoise and the hare, Aesop's fable. Rocky Balboa, that just sort of gets your adrenaline going. He took on Apollo Creed, man, and it's a great movie. When William Wallace basically took on all of England, this is the Scottish and the movie Braveheart. Or if you remember the movie Hoosiers, Hoosiers is all about the underdog, and it's this little nondescript high school that goes to state championship in Indiana, and Gene Hackman is the coach. But it's all about the underdog. The underdog. Can the underdog beat giant? Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox. This is so Uncle Remus, and the rabbit beat the fox, not by being stronger, but by being smarter. Please don't throw me in the briar patch. Don't throw me in the briar. And you laugh because and these were written in slavery kind of days, particularly when the African Americans were David, and how do we fight the Goliath? Well, these were sort of code stories that you got to be smarter. Don't throw us in the briar patch or whatever. These are great stories. Or Seabiscuit. Susie, you know the story. Is he from Claiborne Farm? I looked him up today. I think he was. Seabiscuit there's a movie about the thoroughbred that won all this money, but he was an underdog horse and gave hope during Depression. What's that?
So we're looking for that
Yeah.
every
And Susan Boyle, you've probably all seen her with that initial moment when she sang on Britain Got Talent, I Dreamed a Dream. And people just she's this just incredibly humble looking woman. And then we all just got, yeah, go Susan, go Susan. The Miracle Mets, when the Mets won the World Series. The Olympic hockey team, when the Americans beat the Russians at Lake Placid. I've been to that arena, and they still talk about, this is the arena. This is the arena where the Americans beat the Russians. And if you're Star Wars, when Luke Skywalker takes on Darth Vader and the Death Star, there's just... And just 2 nights ago, I heard somebody talking about Netanyahu's speech at the United Nations last Friday, I think. Talk about a David and a Goliath. 45 minutes of silence. Seconds, of silence. I don't know if you read it. It's incredibly dramatic. and he's just looking them all in the eye with what I think is the truth about Iran and Israel's presence in the Middle East. And he's just, the whole world is sort of against him. It's like, that's David. And the Israelis love the story of David and Goliath. I've got a quote somewhere in here of Moshe Dayan and the 6-Day War. It's all about David and Goliath. Anyway, that's introduction, okay? C, the most famous underdog story of all time is undoubtedly David and Goliath. I first heard it in Sunday school via the state-of-the-art technology of... Oh, you guys are great. And it was my mother. My mother, she was... And I can still remember the images and the story. You know, there was no blood and gore with flannel graph, but it's G.K. Chesterton. If you've read his book, Orthodoxy, he's got a chapter in there called Ethics of Elfland, which is a great title for a chapter, Ethics of Elfland. And what he says, the stories you hear as children is what determines the future, it determines everything. Never underestimate the power of stories we tell our children. And David and Goliath is just right up there at the top. You know, a little boy with 5 smooth stones makes a giant fall down. And it shapes your future. Okay, there's a little chart of the passage, but let me just read. Let's take our Bibles and 1 Samuel 17. It's a long chapter. Okay, ready to go? And again, I've got the English Standard Version. This is what I read from. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes Damim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with the valley between them. I can see it on flannel graph as clear as day in my mind. It's so clear. And verse 4, and there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath. I mean, even his name, he's a bad dude already, you can tell. Of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. We'll come back to translate that into feet and inches in a moment. He had a helmet of bronze on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man." I wish I knew how to dramatize it. Give me a man, that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were greatly dismayed and greatly afraid, trembling in their sandals. Skip down to verse 16. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand, morning and evening. So for 40 days this has been going on. 40 days. Let's pick it up at verse 24. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who's come up? Surely he's come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches. and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. In other words, tax-exempt status for your family. And David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, so shall it be to the man who kills him. Verse 28. Now Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you've come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before King Saul. And he sent for David, and David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of Goliath. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. You're but a youth, and he's a professional soldier. He's seasoned, and you're just a teenager. Verse 34, but David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, because he's defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. Which I think translated means good luck. If you know Saul, that's what it means. Verse 38. Then Saul clothed David with Saul's armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I can't go in these. I've not tested them. So David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch, and his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, because he was a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with the sword and with the spear and with the javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of heaven, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I'll give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, so that all the earth can know that there's a God in Israel. And all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword or spear, because the battle is the Lord's. He'll give you into our hand. It's good stuff. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. I need special effects on this. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sharaim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. We'll stop there. Pretty good story. There are three main characters. Let's talk about the characters, just sort of talk about them. This is how the text seems to unfold. There's Goliath, there's Saul, and there's David. Are you with me? So we're on the top of the page. Goliath. We are given a great deal of information about him. It's amazing, surprising how much information we're given about this monster. His ethnicity and national identity, he's from Gath, he's a Philistine. His religion, he's uncircumcised, just in case you wanted to know, and he's a polytheist. His size, 6 cubits and a span. How big's a cubit? 18 inches. A cubit is supposed to be at this distance, from your elbow to your tip of your finger, and a span is this distance from the span of your hand. So he's how many cubits? And a span, which comes out to over 9 feet. That's NBA size and more. What do your footnotes say on his size? Any of you have footnotes? Or 3 meters. Okay. We've still got to translate that too, we Americans, don't we? Okay. Okay. His weapons, we're told a lot about. He has a bronze helmet, a coat of mail made of bronze that probably went from his shoulders to his knees, and it weighed 5,000 shekels, which is, who's got a footnote? 125 pounds. Just his armor weighed 125 pounds. I mean, this is a bad dude. This is an intimidating character. He has bronze shin guards. He's got a bronze javelin, which must have been a short spear sort of for stabbing. A javelin is an interesting instrument. He's got a big spear whose shaft was the size of a weaver's beam. So the shaft of the spear was like this, and the head of the spear, made of iron, weighed how much? 600 shekels is 15 pounds. The head of the spear is 15 pounds. I mean, this is state-of-the-art weaponry. This is intimidating. And this seems a little unfair, but he's got somebody else that goes with him, the shield bearer. It's like, that's not fair. What if he fights too? And, okay? Number 5, the power of intimidation and the use of psychological warfare. I mean, he wasn't just intimidating, he knew how to be intimidating, like every terrorist knows how to do. I mean, this is your original Palestinian terrorist. It really is. His words, I read them, but you need the right tone of voice to read them well. His words are blasphemous, vile, and defiant. Like, he is a terrorist and the prototypical bully. bully. There's some very interesting stuff being written and done in America today, particularly in school systems, about bullying. Bullying is a real problem. Well, this is Exhibit A of your bully. Loud, vile, intimidating, big, dirty mouth, just in your face. You don't know what's going on inside his heart. He may be just a frightened little boy inside, but he doesn't look like it. He's a bully. A couple of notes. This is interesting, and I'll just give you, let me read it to you. It's just interesting. Goliath may have suffered from a medical condition called acromegaly. This abnormality is caused by a problem with the pituitary gland, which results in an overproduction of growth hormone. People that study giants or people that have huge hands or huge feet. One side effect can be poor vision. And one of the people I read talked about this may explain why he had an armor bearer who actually was leading. He couldn't see far. And he was very good in hand-to-hand combat, but at a distance, he couldn't see, and he needed help. And it also may explain why he said, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" Well, he only had one staff, but if he had double vision, as one of the side effects, he may have... I don't care, it's just interesting. Commentaries love this kind of stuff. But this is part of the reason I'm saying it, is for note number 2. And this surprises me a little, what I'm trying to say here. Without belittling the very real threat that Goliath poses to Israel, it takes only a little effort to feel a measure of sympathy for this overgrown bully. And again, I'm not trying to create a sympathy party for Goliath, but I'm asking the question, what does God see? And even what did David see when he saw Goliath? When I look at Goliath, I see a monster. But a lot of bullies, and read the literature on bullies, they are frightened little boys. They are frightened little boys who the only way they've found to cope with the world is to intimidate people. And if you can get past the facade, they're just a frightened little boy inside. I say that as a male, because males don't want to be thought of as frightened little boys. And that's why we like to have an image of being tough guy, Marlboro Man, or whoever your tough guy is. Always the subject of jokes and derision because of his size. I mean, imagine growing up, what people must have called him. Suffering, perhaps from bad eyesight, filled with massive insecurities. Goliath was perhaps like many bullies, an insecure little boy hiding underneath all that impressive weaponry, defiant verbosity, and arrogant belligerent. These pictures of ISIS that we've seen, the executions particularly, the executors, what's going on in their hearts? What kind of family did they grow up in? What kind of insecurities do they have? They're bullies. They're dangerous. And again, the point is not here. The point is what God said to Samuel about David. Don't look at the outward appearance. Man looks at the outward appearance. God is looking at hearts. And he is at David's heart, and he is at Goliath's heart. It's just, I got sort of stuck on this today, just thinking about, wonder who Goliath's mother was. Wonder what kind of upbringing he had. Why did he get there? Okay, interesting for me anyway. Let's talk about Saul. Saul, being the tallest man in Israel, and the text says that twice. He was head and shoulders above everybody else, and himself having a fine suit of armor, when almost nobody in the army had armor, because the Philistines had made it impossible to own armor. So Saul is the tallest, and Saul has armor. So when Goliath, a tall guy in armor, walks out, says, "Give me a man." What do you think all the soldiers in the Israeli army thought? "Saul, where are you? You're almost as tall as he is, and your armor can make you battle." And Saul's just missing in action. He doesn't go there at all. He's the obvious choice. Saul was the obvious candidate to fight Goliath, but like the rest of the Israelite army, Saul was dismayed and greatly afraid. Goliath's bullying worked. Saul became paralyzed, inactive, passive. He therefore decides to find someone else to take on this battle. Saul is the classic example of the victim. Low self-confidence, fear, anxiety, depression, feelings of powerlessness, submissive, and passive. I was pretty close to a pastor friend who, when he was in junior high school, was subjected to bullying. And he was victimized in awful ways by bullies. And in his adult life, I mean, this is like 25 years later, he went into post-traumatic stress disorder and was out of commission for like 6 months. I mean, bullying is serious, serious stuff. And being a victim is serious, serious stuff. It's real. But Saul is just rendered impotent, inactive, passive. David, no one could have predicted that David, small, at least small compared to Goliath, young, probably a teenager, a civilian, he's not a soldier, he's a shepherd, he's unarmed, and he's a newcomer. No one could have predicted that David would beat Goliath. So imagine a boxing match. That's the blank there. Imagine a boxing match, if you've ever watched a boxing match, where the referee comes out and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, in this corner," this is how I envision this, and I'd love to dramatize it. "In this corner, weighing 355 pounds, measuring 9 feet tall, a professional soldier for 10 years with a record of 48 knockouts and no losses, wearing 125 pounds of armor, carrying a sword and spear and javelin, Goliath." And roar, Goliath. I mean, this is it. "And in this corner, weighing 145 pounds, measuring 5 foot 9 inches tall. And for 5 years, he's taken care of his father's sheep. He's a poet and a songwriter and a musician, wearing no armor and carrying a staff and a slingshot. David." And there's sort of an awkward silence, as people say, a few clap. It's like, I wonder who's going to win this battle. I mean, it seems obvious, doesn't it? But we know the story. And the point, I think, of the whole narrative is the author wants you to feel how one-sided, what an underdog, what impossible odds this is. That's when God wants to step in. Okay, here's our study. All that's introduction. Now we're ready for the sermon. What does it take to be a giant killer? Giants and bullies still exist, whether they come in the form of physical threats of violence or whether they come in the form of misfortune, oppression, injustice, sickness, disabilities. These powerful opponents threaten us and often render us passive and impotent. From David's example, we can learn what it takes to step into the ring and take on our giant in face-to-face combat. Okay? So here's A, B, C, D, E, F. So you can come up with your own list, but this is how I've outlined it. So the point here is for you to think about a giant that you're facing. Go ahead. Start thinking about it. Something that's big and threatening. It may be physical, could be medical, could be financial, could be personal, interpersonal. Think about your giant. What does it take to be a giant killer? Later in our study, we're going to see when David has a group of soldiers called David's Mighty Men. And the main qualification to be a mighty man in David's army was you got to go kill a giant. Has nothing to do with where you went to school or what's on your resume. If your resume doesn't say, I went into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion, or I killed a left-handed Egyptian, with a club. You read it's in 2 Samuel 23. How do you be a David's mighty man? You got to do what David did. Take out a giant. Our men's group at Loudonville was called David's Mighty Men. I get excited about that title, David's Mighty Men. Okay, number 1. A, see the situation with new eyes. Get a new perspective. Or in some literature, reframe. You'll hear people in conflict resolution talk about you've got to reframe. You've got to think differently. David's brothers and all the soldiers had 40 days. They were thinking the very same thing. There's Goliath. He's threatening. None of us can win. What are we going to do? And they were just stuck in that thought. David walked in, and he didn't see what everybody else saw. It looked different with his eyes. This is very interesting. Man, and this is the key verse in David's life, man looks on the outward appearance, God looks on the heart. David, filled with the Holy Spirit, was able to see what others could not see. So let's just try to list some and ask, why could David see this? Saul and Israel saw a personal threat. David saw a threat to my family, a threat to my brothers, a threat to my nation. This isn't about me. This is about my family. Egocentric people, it's about me. I might get hurt. I don't think David was worried about getting hurt. He was worried about his family and his nation. Second bullet. Similar. Saul says, this is all about me. David says, no, it's not. This is all about God. That uncircumcised thug is dragging my God's name in the mud. And you are going to sit around and let him do that? This isn't about me. It's about God. Saul saw a dangerous terrorist. David saw, and I love this, he's just an uncircumcised Philistine. I don't fully know what to do with that, but I like it. He's not a terrorist. He's an uncircumcised. He's an unbeliever. He's a Philistine. Saul said, this is my battle. David said, no, it's not. This is God's battle. That's a huge one. Think about the cross on the water tower. Is that my battle or is that God's battle? That's a pretty important perspective. And it's going to affect how I fight that, if I'm going to fight or do something. Is this about me? My town? My water tower? I don't think it's going to go well if I think that way. David didn't think, he said, no, that's God's water tower. I don't know. That may not be the best parallel, but you're getting the idea. Here's a good one I like. Saul said, Goliath is so big I can't win. David said, Goliath is so big I can't miss. That's an easy target, man. He's huge. And I laugh too. It's like, I think that's how he thought. The bears and the lions were a lot tougher than that rascal. Come on, they had tiny little foreheads. His head's got a big head. Anyway, Saul's perspective was Goliath is well equipped with modern weapons. David said He's weighed down with cumbersome accessories. He's lumbering around on the field. I can outrun him. I can circle him 3 times before he can turn around once. It's like, wow, that's true. And that's the point this guy is making. Just from a human perspective, armies with slingshots versus armies in heavy weaponry have a pretty good track record. It's like, that's interesting if you like the history of warfare. Saul thought somebody ought to do something. David thought, I ought to do something. That's pretty convicting right there. Saul thought he has a sword and a spear. David thought, I got a slingshot. And it's good. I'm good with it. He's intimidating. But there's an article by Moshe Dayan, who was the one-eyed general in Israel. Remember him in the 6-Day War? But he said, don't underestimate a slingshot. The 6-Day War was 6 days long, and they took out the Arab forces. It's like, that's how he was thinking. Saul said, this is a huge problem. David said, this is a huge opportunity. People are going to talk about this for 3,000 years when he hits the ground. And we are. That's what we're doing tonight. Saul said, I might get hurt. Bless your little heart. You know, David said God's reputation might get hurt. So, point number 1. In facing your Goliath, what do you see? What do you see? What's your perspective? Let me ask the question, how did David get that perspective? How do you get to see like that? I'm not... Okay. Yeah, it doesn't happen with a zap, so there's a preparation of seeing giant problems in new ways. I like that. What else? How do you...
Well, David tending the sheep, he was responsible for the sheep, and here he's feeling responsible then to God, not only for God, but to God for this situation.
That's good. What else? How do we...
He spent a lot of time alone, thinking and playing, singing, things like this. And then he saw what nature was doing, how things were. He got a real picture, better picture of who God was. Because he'd be out there at night.
Yeah.
He had the Holy Spirit, too.
He was, in the end of chapter 16, the Spirit of God rushed upon him. And I certainly believe that's a huge piece of this. You've got an army for 40 days. They see the same thing. They see the problem. They see the intimidation. This teenage kid walks up, and the first day he gets there, he sees what nobody else can see. Yeah. Let's keep going. Second thing to do, B, and not necessarily the order, but what does it take to be a giant killer? So A was see the situation with new eyes. B is be prepared. If you were a Boy Scout, that was the motto, be prepared. Yeah. Lord help the Boy Scouts. It may seem that giant killers just appear suddenly, full-grown, ready for battle out of nowhere, but don't be fooled. During years of obscurity, when no one was looking, David had been preparing for this battle, developing a proven track record. In other words, this looks from the outside like it was David's first battle, No, it wasn't. He had his sheep in the mouth of a lion and a bear and pulled the sheep out of the mouth. That's what he says. And he grabbed them by the beard. I guess that's a lion. I don't think bears have beards, do they? I don't know. But that's close hand-to-hand combat. So he's got a track record. Nobody knew about it. It wasn't written in the papers. He was no professional soldier, but that didn't mean David didn't know how to fight. Underdogs work long and hard when no one else is watching. I think I said this the last time we met, but I picture David out with his sheep and his slingshot, just hour after hour. Boom, put up a tin can on a limb, and just hour after. If you've raised sons, you know this routine. Just hour after hour after hour, throwing a football through a swinging tire, or whatever. Just hour after practice, and he was good, and he knew he was good. Don't expect to win in the big battles if you are not being faithful in the small battles. And I mean things like daily disciplines, witness to our neighbors, tithing, victory over bad habits. Why do you think God's going to let you fight a battle that gets your name in the papers, if you're not being faithful in the little things? Jesus said, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I'll set you over much." Let's keep going. C, keep your motives pure. David's big brother accused him of having selfish motives, but that only revealed Eliab's own impure intentions. You just want the reward, little brother. It's like, well, we know where your heart is, Eliab. David is not motivated by personal reward. He's not motivated by duty or responsibility. And he's not motivated by hatred of Goliath. I think that's real important. He's not fighting Goliath because he hates Goliath. He did not come to this battle seeking his own glory, but God's, that all the earth may know that there's a God in Israel. The battle is the Lord. Here's a great quote from G.K. Chesterton. The true soldier fights not because he hates what's in front of him, but because he loves what is behind. That's really good. So why do you fight? Are your motives pure? D, use the right weapons. It seemed logical to borrow Saul's armor, but David was not seduced into letting Goliath set the terms for battle. See, but Goliath wanted hand-to-hand combat. Goliath was virtually invincible in hand-to-hand combat. He was just this. And David said, we're not going to fight that way. And it made Goliath furious. He said, you can't do that. Saul's armor might work for Saul, but David needed to fight with the weapons that were uniquely suited to David and most honoring to God. The truth is that a man with a slingshot, speed and agility, distance, a rock moving at 80 miles an hour, that's about the speed of a Major League Baseball pitcher up to the 90 miles an hour. You get hit in the head with a baseball going 90 miles an hour. I mean, that's serious. That's why they wear helmets. And a rock going at that speed. I actually Googled. I've thought about showing it to you, but there's pictures of people slinging rocks and hitting things like watermelons. It's pretty impressive. It's a serious weapon. It's a serious weapon.
Years ago, Richard Gere played David in a movie. It was in the theaters, and they showed that scene, and they used 3 rocks. And somebody out in the audience went, "He only used 1."
Yeah.
I didn't see that. Anyway, okay. For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. The weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but they have divine power to destroy strongholds. So use the right weapons. Use the right weapons. Use the slingshot God gave you. E, almost done. Trust in the Lord. The text makes it clear that David's trust was not in his slingshot, but in his Lord. I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. The battle is the Lord's. He will give you into our hand. It was this trust that gave him courage. Which simply means that David refused to let his feelings of fear control his actions. When the Bible says fear not, I don't believe it's saying don't have feelings of fear. You sort of can't control your feelings. What it's saying is don't be controlled by your fears. It is sobering to remember that the lake of fire is where all cowards will be thrown. If somebody wants to look that up, but in the lake of fire, it gives a list of those who will be thrown in the lake of fire. And if my memory's right, number 1 on the list, thank you, number 1 on the list is cowards. That's this one book I read on bullying. The author was making a plea. If you witness bullying, a bully bullying somebody else, you step in between them and say, leave him alone, which is what Jesus said when the Pharisees were picking on Mary. Leave her alone. And most bullies will back off if there's intervention. But we don't do it because we're cowards. And in that book, the author quoted Revelation 21 and said, cowards go to the lake of fire. I said, wow, that's an impressive argument. But cowards. The battle will be determined not by the size of your enemy, but by the size of your God. David was simply living in the reality of what God had promised his people long ago through Moses. Listen to this from Deuteronomy. When you go out to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army larger than your own, you shall not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to give you the victory. Little wonder that David could say in Psalm 11, in the Lord I take refuge. How can you say to my soul, flee like a bird to the mountain? For behold, the wicked bend the bow. They have fitted their arrow to the string to shoot the upright in heart. I'll not flee. And finally, be filled with the Spirit. It takes more than human skill, ingenuity, and courage to defeat Goliath. When the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David, he was given abilities to do things he could not do in his own strength. It was this indwelling Spirit that ignited a fire of passionate zeal and love for God in his soul that propelled him into battle. Nobody goes into battle unless they're filled with zeal and passion. No longer could he sit by passively as God's reputation was slandered and his name defiled. For the zeal for your house has consumed me, and the reproaches of those who reproach you has fallen on me. Well, that always takes more time than I think it's going to. I do want you to think about your giant and what it takes to take him out. You want me to read you the ballad of David the Giant Gillett? Can I read you the ballad? It's a sermon, but it's in poem. This will be our closing. Come listen, my friends, and a tale you'll be told of a lad that was honest and faithful and bold. With God in his heart and a stone in his sling, he went out as a child and returned as a king. So if you will listen and lend me your ears, you too can slay giants and conquer your fears. Davy, oh Davy, I marvel and wonder. You sing like an angel, then fight like all thunder. But stop and consider, it's really not odd, for Davy's whole heart is devoted to God. Goliath stepped out on the field for the fight. His armor, his voice and demeanor, his height made Israel tremble and cower in fear and pray that this monster would just disappear. The army of Israel froze in their places. Panic and terror were etched on their faces. But Davy just happened to be there that day and heard what the ogre did mockingly say. You're sissies and wimps, and the one you call Lord is no match for my strength or my size or my sword. Come out and do battle, and let the world know that I and my gods are in charge of this show. It seemed that the giant's assessment was true, for no one in Israel knew what to do. No scripture was quoted and none said a prayer. The mood of the moment was deep, dark despair. It seemed that the forces of darkness had won before the encounter had even begun. Then Davy stepped forward in passion so hot, I'll fight this giant, just give me one shot. Just who does he think that he's mocking like this? He's so big and so brazen, I really can't miss. I refuse to sit still while my God he's defying. I'll teach him a lesson, or I'll die while I'm trying. So Davy went forth with a sling and a prayer, and sent a rock flying up into the air. And down came Goliath with one mighty thud. He collapsed and he fell to the earth in the mud. And wanting to make sure the foul monster was dead, Davy walked over and cut off his head. So listen, dear friends, to what Davy would say when giants oppose you and stand in your way. Trust firmly in God. Don't listen to fear. His strength and his wisdom and might will appear. Just when your status appears at its bleakest, he loves to show off his power in the weakest. That's good. Lord, thank you for this wonderful story and the chance to share it together. And as we've been thinking about our giant, let this story fill our hearts with hope and put passion in our souls and give us feet that run to the battle, trusting in the one who calls us. Let giants fall, we pray, because we've opened your word and been taught by your Spirit tonight. In Jesus' name and for the sake of the kingdom, amen. Good night.